But when you've had so much experience with people coming with ideas and inventors, so we kind of wanted to dive into the idea of innovation within the running industry with you and just kind of hear some thoughts. So when you reflect on everything that you've been doing, that you've done in the past, and that you've learned from other people that as you worked with them, what do you think are some of the things that it requires to have success when you're innovating something? Like, when do you see something you're like, this is going to be something that's going to succeed, or you see something like, hey, this is going to fall short? Are there any common threads that you start to see when it comes to innovation? And maybe things you've seen recently that are like, hey, that makes sense of why that took off or not.
Well, I think that when you talk about innovation, you have to think two levels. There, you have to think about what are the product ideas that succeed and fail, and also what are the corporate dynamics that succeed and fail. And you really have to understand, if you're going to innovate, that corporations are set up to be innovation condoms. And they put every conceivable blocking method in the way of innovation because it doesn't fit neatly into a plan. It's hard to predict the future. So almost every organization overemphasizes doing what they did last year, just doing it better. Converse worked themselves out of the performance basketball business because they could never adapt or change. They just kept doing what they'd been doing since 1922. And so ideas that change, I think that for ideas to work, they have to, one, interest the consumer. Why are you doing this? And does the consumer almost immediately get it? Why did Air succeed when they put a window in it? Because you could see it. Oh, that makes sense, right? Why didn't it work before? They couldn't see it. They got it intellectually. You could explain it, but they couldn't see it. Why did Hoka work? Because it looked so different. And then when you put it on your feet, it felt different. So I think you have to arrest the user's mind. And then when it gets put on their foot, it has to do what you say it's going to do. You don't have to teach a dog to eat a steak, right? But if you have to put a new shoe on somebody's foot and say, well, you need to spend a week running in this different way, and and you have to have your gait do this and your that do that, and then don't you feel great?
Yeah.
If you have to keep explaining it, I think it's problematic. I don't know if that's a great answer, but do something different that feels different, that functions differently, that the consumer finds to be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. And almost, although it's different, it still feels somewhat of a natural, like you don't have to fight it. You don't have to fight into it. It just kind of, it works, but it works differently.
Yeah, and you think about, one of the most amazing things you have to think about with footwear, and this is where I believe the footwear industry, those of us who've been in executive positions with company, it's hard to think about, if you went out and you said, what are the greatest inventions from 1935 or 1940 to 1970, I think almost every one of those great inventions would have come from Adidas. Horst Dassler, he invented a shoe for every track and field event, right? I mean, meaningful changes.
Right.
Converse and their Converse high top and the Chuck Taylor, that came from a company, right? And then the introduction of the midsole, I think it was just the concept of a midsole came in. There's who did it first. I'm not sure, but all of that came from a shoe company. If you look at the greatest inventions of the last 40 years, I have a hard time thinking of any of them that have actually come from a shoe company. Air didn't come from Nike Air didn't come from a shoe company. It came from an inventor, and about 30 or 40 companies rejected it. Carbon fiber came from carbon fiber companies. Now, I think that shoe companies have really done a good job, again, 30 years after it was introduced, into applying it in a great new way. All right.
Yeah.
And so that should count. But if you think about Boost foam or supercritical foams, those came from outside companies.
Totally.
And I don't know, 10, 15, 20 companies rejected Boost because it didn't look like PU and EVA.
Yeah.
Hoka, which is, I think, the most impactful technology in the footwear space certainly in the last 12 years, but probably in the last 20. It's one of the few technologies that every single footwear brand is copying. Everybody has oversized. Everybody has rocker. That came from two French guys working out there in the mountains in France, in the Alps, Chamonix. And you just keep going down the list. And what does this tell you? This tells you that if you're going to lead in innovation, you have to be open to ideas no matter where they come from.
Yeah.
Because all of these footwear companies have brilliant people. But there are more brilliant people outside their company than inside their company. And therefore, you're going to have to sort through 50, 100, 200 bad ideas, but you better be alert enough when the big idea comes, and you can't simply just reject everything. And too many companies reject. I swear to you, even with the success that I've had, if I had the next great thing and placed a phone call, I would get run through the gauntlet and treated like a raw rookie because, it's not on the business plan, or we got the lawyer who says we're at risk for doing this and we can't look at that. And
yeah,
it gets, and I think the other challenge with footwear right now is most of the technology development is happening at the suppliers in Asia. And that puts everybody sort of on the same plane of innovation.
Yeah.
And it also means that there's a lot less expertise within the brand itself in terms of how does it actually work, or what tweak can we make it. There's just a lot of reliance on vendors.
That makes sense.
And I think that's completely different than the great technology companies like Tesla or Apple or IBM in the day. Those guys are not generally outsourcing the development of raw technology. So footwear is just a little different.
Yeah. It almost seems like, as you were talking about some of the stuff and where innovation is really happening and how it really happens, there's almost like micro innovation that's happening within the running shoe industry, where companies are taking the technologies and geometries that already exist and just kind of repackaging them. But the real innovation happens when something kind of surprises you. You kind of brought up Hoka as an example. I think, like you said, the Air is another example where those things are coming from outside. They're not just like repackaging new things within the running industry. It's got to come from some other mind where you're not just stuck in running, because it's seeing something outside of the running industry that they think, why don't you try to put this in a running shoe? We might not think about it if we're buried in the running world too much.
And there's a lot more brain power on. I mean, I remember when New Balance invented the Achilles notch, and you think now you guys go, oh well, yeah. Well, it used to be you get your pair of shoes, you take your scissors and cut off the damn Achilles thing because it'd come up and create a blister, right? And they created the little thing over the toes so your toes didn't keep going through the mesh. And so there's a lot of things that have piled one on another where these footwear brands have added a lot of comfort features. But raw innovation it's widespread, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And how the brands apply. I mean, what people are doing with carbon fiber and what Nike did with their carbon fiber. I'm surprised. We introduced carbon fiber to footwear in 1986. Brooks had a propulsion plate, essentially what they're doing now in 1987. And that propulsion plate was placed in a little different, it was placed between the outsole and the midsole. But it took another 20 years for people to really say, hey, how do we use carbon fiber, like a pole vault where it has that real spring? And, I'm look at me. I introduced carbon fiber and I never did that. And I didn't come up with a way to do that. And Nike and the others deserve a lot of credit for doing that. But they're taking base technologies and reapplying them, if you will. Yeah.
I think another company that popped into my mind, and you mentioned Brooks, and you mentioned a couple things. One was that there was, which company did you say Converse worked themselves out of the basketball world by just doing one tick at a time. And there's been a couple within the running shoe geek world. There's a couple companies over the last 5-10 years that were kind of accused of doing that and that they were becoming irrelevant. People talked about ASICs that way until the last couple of years. People talk about Brooks a little bit like that right now. But I think, something that I think they're starting to do is Brooks just came out with last year that, we haven't tested this shoe, but it was that called the Aurora BL from their Blue Line Labs. And you talked about visibility of the thing, and they put like I think it's a fake little injection looking area, but they talked about how, this foam is injected with, air and foam or whatever. And so they're trying to create that visual that you were talking about while also creating a shoe that looked weird. It just looked different. And so they're trying to catch people's eyes, leading innovation that way. So that seems to match like a lot of the advice that you're giving or the wisdom you've gleaned about innovation. So,
look, Nike or Adidas launched a whole series. Really the biggest thing that's happened in the last 10 years is foam, right? And, when Nike came out with Air, we were all trying to figure out how to get away from foam. It was gels and this is and that's and the other thing. And then they come out with this supercritical foam, again, that about, 20, 30 companies rejected from BASF because it didn't look like what they had done, right? And Adidas then started a foam race, and that foam race has resulted in a lot of good things. And so it took BASF to make it, and then it took people at Adidas that had the vision to say, hey, we're okay not looking the same. And they've built a franchise around foam. And, if you'd asked me 10 years ago if you could build a franchise around foam, I'd go, what the hell? No way. Right. Foam's dumb. And, look at me. I'm now in the foam business. So, So I think you just have to be careful. We all have some wins and we all have some losses, and we all see some things and we all miss some things. I certainly would have missed supercritical foams, or I wouldn't have bet a lot of money that we're going to spend 10 years pioneering new foams, But that shows you also the power of these big chemical companies to drive change. Now, we can talk about how good foam is for the environment. Foam, is really, that's like calling a high octane cocktail a drink. Foam is plastic. Yeah. And we talk about plastic and we talk about foam, and foam sort of gets a pass because it's not called plastic, but it's really just expanded plastic. It's worse than plastic in a water bottle because you've taken 2 or 3 parts and you've blown them up, and you're never going to, put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And but anyway, I guess that's a digression. But
and we talked before this. We're going to work with. Yeah. We're going to work with Stuart on we're working on some sustainability pieces in the running industry, and he's got a lot of experience there. We'll talk about it a bit more when we get to Blue Maca, just to touch on it today. But I think another question that we had for you, something that we talk about here at Doctors of Running, is that innovation is usually a number of steps ahead of research regarding that innovation. So, something like Hoka is going to come out with their rocker, or minimalist footwear is going to come out. And then 10 years later, you have the summit on minimalist footwear. And it's already after that that change in the way that shoes are designed comes when you're sitting on the inside of innovation. And I guess our question for you, even before our question, I think one of the things that we see is our part here as people who are able to analyze biomechanics, work with a lot of injured people. We kind of look at what are these innovations actually doing to the foot, to the mechanics, to people, to injury risk, that kind of thing. But when you look at the process, is there a role of research alongside innovation, or testing these things in a lab? Or is it a lot of innovation with a lot of ideas and just kind of hoping it works out? Or are there things that validate it along the way?
Well, if you're truly innovating, you have to validate along the way. I think of, and you've used, R&D, let's call research and development, is how you turn dollars into ideas. And innovation is how you turn ideas into dollars. And the research that you're talking about, I would call it testing and efficacy. Mm-hmm. And I believe that it's really imperative that there is real world efficacy to technologies. Like and here's, for example, what's the most important piece of equipment a runner wears? Shoes. Yeah. Why is it important? Because it is a protection against impact. And, this is why I really went after Hoka when I first saw it. You could have blindfolded me and I could have worn any brand of running shoes on the market and I couldn't have told you what brand I was wearing, and neither could the brand president of that company. Okay? And I think that if you looked at the data, there wasn't any significant reduction in injuries from better, quote unquote, better and better running shoes from 1975, when midsoles became popular, until 2010. So if we were making certainly more expensive running shoes and so-called better running shoes and had all this technology, flubber and wubber and dubber and blah, 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 why didn't injury rates go down, and why didn't people's knees feel better? Yeah. And so when I saw Hoka, we all know, as physical therapists, more force goes through the ball of the foot than the heel. Why did we always put more cushioning in the heel than the ball of the foot? It's back-ass words, right? I mean, that's like putting your football helmet on your butt. And so what Hoka really did, the genius of Hoka is that they put more cushioning under the ball of the foot, because while the peak G's in the ball of the foot are not higher, there is more force going through that foot because it comes down and slaps, drives downward, and then pushes off. So there's a lot of force going under, and we've cushioned it less well. And so by putting a rocker under, you got to the forefoot without slapping. Then in that point of dwell, you put more cushioning there. And so, if the existing way we were making shoes, we were all locked into the triangular shape, if injury rates weren't coming down and we had all this technology, shouldn't we try a different geometry? Mm-hmm. Right? Can't we just allow ourselves to say why? If it isn't working, try something different. Now, I don't have any data to prove, but I would bet that people that run in Hoka are probably have less impact on their joints and body than people that don't. I don't know. But, if you put twice as much foam under your foot, it could help, as long as it's not unstable. Yeah. Matt, my experience was I'd been running for many, many years, and my knees would hurt all the time. And I started running in Hoka, and for 10 years, my knees haven't hurt. Now, that's an anecdote. But I think that other people are having that experience, which is why it's grown from, 0 to 850 or $1 billion company in 10 years. while facing the biggest marketing behemoths on the planet. And it's why everybody in the footwear industry who lost their mind and made barefoot shoes, running shoes, is now copying Hoka.
Right. So Matt, maybe we'd love to talk about foam and cushioning and stack and kind of the benefits. What do we know, from kind of the third-party research on, increased cushioning rocker soles, and do we decrease forces? Do we change them? What do we talk about there?
So that's the challenge, is because, Stuart, you mentioned that these, like Hoka's design, there's so many variables that have changed. That's why research is really hard, because when you're doing good research, and I'm learning this as a PhD student right now, as I'm getting my, just torn apart every single day with every single idea I have, which is, again, to help me refine this. When you change a lot of variables, it becomes difficult to figure out which one is actually making a change and who it's making a change for. So we know from the evidence, ironically, that more cushioning actually doesn't seem to change impact forces. It sometimes can actually increase internal loading in the joint because people will land harder. However, right, even though we're seeing that biomechanically, we'll still get the testimonial reports that people are feeling less symptoms in certain areas. So that's where you got to ask, yes, there's more cushioning. There's a comfort filter, right, which Ben Onig was really a pioneer of, and we're still working on. So is it, we're seeing research, the biomechanical data is showing that it can actually increase joint forces, which is not actually necessarily a bad thing. Okay. But then there's a comfort factor, but then you also have the fact that there's the rocker, which is going to change where you're loading. So we know shoes don't change the amount of force, but they can certainly shift it. And that's one of the things that I really like about Hoka's design, is that the rocker shifts it up higher. And so right now in the PT world, there's a big shift trying to get people to use their hips more, because we sit so much, we don't tend to utilize that. A rockered sole actually forces you to use more hip mechanics, which is really good because you need good, strong hip mechanics for your knee. So there's no evidence on that, but that's kind of some of the pieces. Yeah. So what you're feeling is not wrong. It's just the exact mechanism. We're not sure.
Right. Yeah. And again, if the dog likes the steak, he's going to eat the steak. I like the steak because my knees don't hurt. I don't know why my knees don't hurt. I can't tell you why my knees don't hurt, but my knees don't hurt. And I know there's millions of people like me, right?